The Bible condemns foolish arguments, but debate and critical thinking are fundamental building blocks towards the growth of intellect and spiritual growth. If you're going to grow and increase in knowledge and increase intellectually and increase spiritually, you must never be afraid of debate and critical thinking. That is the arena by which you will increase intellectually and spiritually. But debate and critical thinking should always, as believers, it's not always this way in the secular classroom or in higher education, but as Christians, debate and critical thinking should always be done with humility and with a teachable spirit. If you're going to be offended by any teacher, preacher, evangelist, minister who teaches on something that you in your heart, it just rubs you the wrong way, then you're the one who loses out. You have to learn, don't miss this, you have to learn to detach yourself from presupposition and preconceived biases and come before the Bible with an open heart. Write that down. You have to be willing as a Christian, if you're going to live in the humility and in the favor and in the increase of God, you have to be willing to lay aside your presuppositions, your predetermined biases, and come to the Bible with an open and teachable heart. So with that said, let's take a look at what does the Bible say about tithing. And in particular, I'll answer before we're done today, are Christians required to tithe? Question number one in your notes, write it down. Number one, what is tithing? It's like the famous Green Bay Packers coach of legend and iconic Hall of Famer, first Super Bowl, Vince Lombardi, the Green Bay Packers. Do you know that every football season, as they started in their training camp in the end of summer, the very first session that Vince Lombardi had with all of the football players was to teach them what a football was. He literally took a football and told them how it was made and how the skin was tanned. Back in those days, footballs were made out of pigskin. He showed how they were laced, the materials used. He talked about inflation and why the football spiraled and how to hold it and on and on. He spent almost the first entire session defining what a football was. Well, sometimes those of us that teach the Bible need to take Vince Lombardi's advice and back up several steps and never assume that people have Bible knowledge. One of my methodologies of teaching is I try to teach in such a way that if somebody just got saved 60 seconds ago or just bought their first Bible yesterday and they're opening it and learning for the very first time, I try to teach in a way that the foundational, basic, fundamental truths are not neglected nor assumed. So question number one, what is tithing? The word tithe simply means a tenth. So tithing means giving 10% of whatever God places in your hands back to God. Now, tithing is better understood when it is taught also in proper context. And this is going to be new territory for some of you that have been saved 10 years, 20 years, 40, 50 years. You've never been taught this, but in the Bible, there are 3 periods of time that deal with tithing. And if you don't understand as you're reading the Bible in context and in the chronology of what the contents hold, and you've never been taught that tithing in the Bible is found in 3 periods of time. Tithing in the Bible, write this down. Tithing in the Bible is found in the context of pre-law. In other words, tithing was taught before the Mosaic Law. Tithing in the Bible, as you're about to discover, is found before the law was given. So we have tithing in the Bible in three contexts. Number one, the context of pre-law. Number two, the context of law. And by law we mean the law given to Moses, or the Mosaic Law. And so we have tithing in the context of the Mosaic Law, and then we have post-law. We have tithing addressed and giving addressed in the scriptures in the context of post-law. So if you're going to be a proper student in understanding tithing, you just can't talk about tithing in a general way. You have to understand that various passages in the Bible are going to fall on the subject of tithing into one of those three categories: pre-law, law, and post-law. Tithing in each of these three contexts has unique definition and specific criteria. Question number two: what was tithing under the Mosaic Law? Because this is oftentimes where there's confusion and people begin to get off track. But in the Old Testament, God's people were required. It wasn't optional. In the Old Testament, in the Mosaic Law, God's people were required to bring both tithes and also, above and beyond their tithes, special offerings. These were taught in the Mosaic Law, and they were not optional. They were required by God. Under the Mosaic Law, there was a theocracy. In the Old Testament, they lived under the theocracy, and Moses taught them three different tithes. And so if you're taking notes, there are three tithes under the Mosaic Law. The first would be considered the regular tithe. And the regular tithe, 10% of all that God placed in their hands, was given to support the priests and the work of the temple. And so in the Old Testament, Mosaic Law, and we're going to get to the pre-law, but I want to lay down, first of all, the centerpiece, the Mosaic Law of tithing. The second tithe in the Mosaic Law was the festival tithe. And the festival tithe, obviously, was received to help to support the various festivals that were held under Jewish law. And then the third tithe was the charity tithe. The charity tithe, and that was only taken every third year, and it was given to the Levitical priesthood, the sojourners, the widows, the fatherless, and the poor. That was called the charity tithe. Now, I don't have time to go into the depth of all of this in one setting. Those of you who are listening, I do have another teaching that we'll be following up with on this subject, where we'll go into a different area to help you find more depth. But if you want to read more about those various laws, you can find them in Deuteronomy chapter 12, Deuteronomy chapter 14, and also in Leviticus chapter 27. But if you'll be patient, I'll come back to these in a later study. But when you understand the three types of laws given and the three tithes of the law that was given under the Mosaic Law, then you realize that it wasn't 10% at all. They had the regular tithe, 10%. They had a second tithe that was given for the support of the festivals, the festival tithe, and the third was the charity tithe. Now, I already did the math for you on this to save you some time, but under the Mosaic Law, they weren't required to tithe 10%, because when you add up the regular tithe, the festival tithe, and the charity tithe, that adds up. Now remember, the charity tithe was only taken every 3 years. But I did the math for you. If you want to write it down, they were required to tithe 23.3% of all of the increase that God placed into their hand. So now you're beginning to understand something that perhaps you've never been taught before, or perhaps it's never been explained to you before, or at least with a Bible in your hand to where you can search it out and see it. But the 3 tithes, the regular tithe, the festival tithe, and the charity tithe equated to a requirement between tithes and offerings. They gave 23.3% of all of their increase. So in the Old Testament, giving a tenth of one's goods, produce, and income to the Lord was a requirement and not an option. And when you take into consideration the 3 tithes that were given under the Mosaic Law, it actually works out not to 10%, but to 23.3%. Now let's get to the commonly asked question: did tithing predate the law? And there's a lot of debate among theologians on how they exegete this truth. But for example, some people that argue against tithing for the New Testament believer, they'll point out that Adam and Eve and the very first family, that from the creation of Adam all the way up until Abraham and Jacob, that there's no record of tithing. And they would say, if Old Testament tithing is true, then how do you explain? Understand tithing biblically, you have to understand tithing in the 3 contexts: pre-law, law, post-law. So God accepted Abel's offering and rejected Cain's. And a lot of people perhaps question exactly why. In fact, I know so because I've had so many questions that have come in on the subject of why did God accept Abel's offering and Cain was rejected? Why? It's also interesting to point out that in the Old Testament, after Adam and Eve, the Bible teaches us and connects the offering of the firstborn and the first fruits to the tithe. And so listen carefully. The offering of Abel and Cain were first fruit offerings or firstborn offerings. They were required by God in the very beginning, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and so forth. In the very beginning, God required of them both a firstborn and a first fruit offering. And many scholars believe that the reason why Cain's offering was rejected is it fell short of the tithe, and that Abel's was abundant and generous, a tithe, or perhaps even more than a tithe. And there's great debate among scholars that the reason Cain's offering was rejected is his first fruit offering was not a true 10%, that perhaps he tried to shortchange God, or give a lesser amount or inferior product of his produce to God. And again, I'll not go into a great deal of teaching on that because it's not completely where I'm headed today. But it's important for you to understand that the firstborn, listen carefully, the firstborn and first fruit offerings that go all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Bible were then connected to the tithe. So it is very possible that Abel's offering was accepted because it was not just a first fruit offering, but it was a tithe or more. The question was asked, where do we first see tithing in the Bible? And if you want to, go with me into Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14, because the very first reference of tithing is found there in Genesis 14 and verse 20. The Bible says, then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. And so Abram tithed to Melchizedek. Now, some would say, well, that's a one-off offering or a one-off tithe. It was not evidence that he did it on a consistent and regular basis. Well, let's go on, because the second reference we find of tithing is in Genesis chapter 28 and verses 20 through 22, where Jacob promises to give God a tenth of everything. Genesis chapter 8, verses 20 through 22, then Jacob made this vow, if God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, and if I return safely to my father's home, then the Lord will certainly be my God. And this memorial pillar I have set up will become a place for worshiping God, and I will present to God a tenth of everything he gives to me. Highlight that in your Bible. For worshiping God, I will present to God a tenth of everything he gives to me. For you see, one of the foundations of understanding tithing is it's not a tax as it was in the Mosaic Law that was required as a part of the theocracy. But the real heart of it is not a tax and not a fee and not something we do out of obligation. But tithing and giving is a true indication of your consecration and your worship to God. And Jacob made that vow, I'll give God a tenth of everything that he gives me. Now again, let me back up. Some theologians debate that Abram and Jacob, they tithed, but it was just a singular tithe. It was not a normal part of how they carried out their responsibilities and what they felt belonged to God. Well, let me argue that from the original Hebrew, that to tithe is